Mark Weston's mornings were usually quiet. The gentle sound of water lapping against the wooden posts of his dock carried up to the porch, and the golden light of sunrise would spill across the lake like liquid warmth. He would sip his coffee, slowly, often watching the herons glide over the still surface, their wings moving with deliberate grace. This morning, however, a plain white envelope lay neatly on top of his mailbox. It had the Lakeshore Heights Homeowners Association logo, printed in crisp green lettering on the top left corner. The envelope was sealed so firmly, it looked as though someone had pressed it closed with extra care. Mark set his mug down, picked up the envelope, and felt the weight of the paper inside. As he walked back toward the porch, he slid his finger under the flap, opening it in one smooth motion. The letter inside was short, formal, and to the point. It read, "Dear Mr. Weston, this notice is to inform you that the dock on your property exceeds the approved length outlined in the Lakeshore Heights Guidelines for shoreline structures. For the harmony of our community's appearance, the dock must be removed or modified to meet the approved standard within 30 days. Thank you for your prompt attention to this matter. Sincerely, Dana Claremont, President, Lakeshore Heights Homemark read the letter twice. He let his eyes linger on the phrase, "for the harmony of our community's appearance." He respected the idea of harmony. In fact, he valued it more than most. But his dock had been there for years, long before the association had even been formed, and it served a purpose far greater than any aesthetic rule. To most people, the dock was just a place to tie up a boat or sit with a fishing pole. But for Mark, it was a hub, the heart of a carefully managed network of waterways. His family had held responsibility for these waters for generations, long before the neat lawns and quiet streets of Lakeshore Heights existed. The dock was not just his property. It was a working part of a much larger system. Mark folded the letter neatly and placed it on the small table beside his chair. He didn't feel angry, though many might have in his position. Instead, he felt curious. What had prompted this now? Was it a general review of all shoreline properties, or had someone singled his out? He picked up his coffee again, letting the steam curl into the cool morning air. The sun was rising higher, casting a brighter shimmer over the water. A pair of ducks paddled near the far end of the dock, and he smiled faintly. The lake didn't care about guidelines or measurements. It had its own way of keeping balance. Still, the letter could not be ignored. He believed in answering things directly, but also in answering them with thought. He would attend the next HOA meeting and listen to what they had to say. Mark leaned back in his chair and let his mind wander to the records in his study. In the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet, he kept a stack of carefully organized documents, old water rights deeds, maintenance permits, and maps marked with his grandfather's handwriting. Those papers told the real story of who had authority here, and they did so in precise legal language that could not be misunderstood. For now, though, there was no rush. The letter gave him 30 days, and 30 days was more than enough time to understand the situation before making his move. A gentle breeze rippled across the surface of the lake, and the reflection of the dock wavered slightly, as though the water itself were thinking. Mark took another slow sip of coffee, watching the light dance and shift. He would go to the meeting. He would hear their reasons. And when the time came, he would decide exactly how much of the truth they needed to know. The evening of the Lakeshore Heights monthly meeting was calm, the air just cool enough to invite a light sweater. Mark arrived at the community hall 5 minutes early, preferring to observe the room before the official discussions began. The hall was small but neatly arranged, with rows of folding chairs facing a table draped in a dark green cloth. Behind, it sat a small nameplate for each board member. A faint scent of fresh coffee drifted from the refreshment table in the corner. Neighbors chatted quietly, their voices blending into a low hum. Mark chose a seat toward the back, giving him a clear view of the entire room. He noticed the board members sorting through a stack of papers and arranging them in tidy piles. At the center of the table sat Dana Claremont, the association's president, her posture perfectly upright. She glanced at a laptop screen and typed something quickly, her expression calm but focused. At exactly 7 o'clock, Dana tapped her pen gently against the table. The conversations faded, and the meeting officially began. "Good evening, everyone," she said with a polite smile. "We have several items to discuss tonight. As always, we appreciate your cooperation and engagement in keeping Lakeshore Heights a beautiful and welcoming place." The first few agenda points passed quickly. Updates on landscaping, reminders about seasonal decorations, and a short discussion about parking on narrow streets. Mark listened quietly, noting how most topics were handled with a friendly balance of formality and efficiency. Then Dana adjusted her glasses and looked down at the next sheet of paper. "The next item is regarding a shoreline structure on Mr. Weston's property." A quiet shift moved through the room. A few heads turned in Mark's direction. Dana continued. "According to our review of shoreline guidelines, the dock exceeds the maximum approved length. While we understand it has been in place for some time, we believe consistency in shoreline appearance is important for the harmony of our neighborhood." She tapped a folder in front of her. "We have photographs and measurements taken earlier this month to confirm this." She gestured to the vice president, who brought up a slideshow on the projector. Images of Mark's dock appeared, taken from different angles. Mark studied the pictures. They were clear and well-framed, showing the dock stretching gracefully over the water. In the photographs, the surface gleamed in the sunlight, and the water below reflected its wooden beams. To him, it looked exactly as it should, a part of the lake's character, not a disruption to it. Dana continued, "We are requesting that Mr. Weston modify or remove the extension to bring it in line with the approved standard. This is not a punitive measure, but rather a way to ensure the shoreline remains consistent for all residents." When she finished, she looked toward him. "Mr. Weston, if you'd like to respond, you're welcome to share your perspective." Mark rose slowly, taking a moment to glance around the room. He could see familiar faces, neighbors he had waved to in passing, some he had helped clear snow in the winter or given extra vegetables from his garden in summer. "Thank you, Dana," he said in a steady, measured voice. "I appreciate the association's efforts to maintain a consistent and pleasant shoreline. My dock has been part of this lake for a long time. I'd like to review the details you've shared before making any decisions. I'm confident we can have a thoughtful discussion about it." Dana nodded politely. "Of course. We can provide the measurements and the relevant section of the guidelines." Mark sat back down, making a few notes in his small leather-bound notebook. He didn't argue or explain anything further. The meeting moved on to other topics, but he noticed occasional glances in his direction. As the discussion shifted to upcoming community events, Mark thought about the documents waiting in his study. He thought about the maps that showed not just his property lines, but the invisible boundaries of responsibility for every inch of water in the county. The meeting ended with polite goodbyes. Dana thanked everyone for attending, and the room slowly emptied. Mark left quietly, stepping into the cool night air. The lake was only a short walk away, and in the moonlight it looked almost silver. As he made his way home, he knew the next steps would require patience. They saw only a dock. They didn't yet see the network of waterways it was connected to, or the role he played in all of it. The morning after the meeting, the lake was covered in a thin veil of mist. It curled upward in slow spirals, giving the water an almost dreamlike appearance. Mark stood at the edge of his dock, hands in his pockets, and watched the first sunlight cut through the fog. The world felt hushed, as though it was waiting for him to make the next move. Inside, his study waited. It was the quietest room in the house, with shelves of worn books and neatly labeled boxes stacked against the far wall. A large oak desk sat in the center, its surface clear except for a small lamp, a fountain pen, and a cup of fresh coffee. Mark unlocked the bottom drawer of a tall cabinet and pulled out a thin folder marked Water Rights, Weston. Inside were papers that had been carefully preserved for decades. The oldest document was yellowed at the edges, written in a precise cursive hand and dated more than a century ago. It bore his great-grandfather's signature alongside a county seal that had since changed design. That document, and the ones that followed, outlined in exact terms the Weston family's authority to maintain, manage, and oversee the waterways of the county. These weren't symbolic titles. They were legal responsibilities, recorded in county archives and supported by modern permits. His dock, by extension, was not just a private structure. It was part of the infrastructure that allowed him to fulfill those duties. He set the papers in order by date, skimming through familiar clauses. The language had shifted over the decades, from the formal, almost poetic tone of the early documents to the straightforward precision of the most recent ones. Yet the message had stayed the same. The Weston family was the steward of these waters. Mark placed the documents on the desk and opened a wide county map. It was an older edition, printed on heavy paper, its creases worn from years of folding and unfolding. The lakes and rivers were marked in dark blue, and thin lines traced the paths of canals and inlets. He ran a fingertip along the main waterway that flowed past his dock, following it to the smaller streams that branched away like roots of a tree. Every one of them fell under his oversight. The thought of it didn't fill him with pride so much as with a sense of calm responsibility. He had grown up understanding that water connected everything: the wildlife, the land, the people who lived along its edges. Managing it wasn't about ownership. It was about care. Still, he knew that not everyone thought in those terms. Guidelines and measurements made sense in their own way, especially for keeping a neighborhood neat. But the association's view was limited to the visible shoreline, while his role extended far beyond it. A faint knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found his neighbor, Ellen, standing with a basket of fresh muffins. "Thought you might like these," she said with a warm smile. "Heard about the meeting last night. Figured it might have been a long one." Mark accepted the basket gratefully. "Thank you, Ellen. Yes, it was thorough." She tilted her head. "You're not too worried about it, are you?" "Not particularly," he replied, keeping his voice light. "It's just something to sort out." After she left, Mark returned to his study. He took one last look at the documents spread across the desk and then carefully placed them back in their protective sleeves. He would not bring them out again until the time was right. For now, he would let the association follow its process. He would keep attending meetings, keep listening, and keep the details of his stewardship to himself. In his experience, revealing the full picture too soon rarely led to understanding. Outside, the mist had lifted and the water shone clear and still. From his window, Mark watched a single rowboat drift lazily toward the center of the lake. The dock beneath it stood steady, just as it had for years. And for the moment, that was all it needed to do. It was a bright afternoon when the white sedan pulled into Mark's driveway. The vehicle had a small magnetic sign on the door that read, "Lakeshore Heights Ho, Property Review." A man in a neatly pressed shirt stepped out, carrying a clipboard and a measuring tape. Mark had been sitting on the porch reading when he noticed the car. He set his book aside, rose, and walked down the steps with an easy pace. "Good afternoon," the man said, offering a polite nod. "I'm here to complete the inspection of your dock." Mark smiled warmly. "Of course. Would you like some water or coffee before you get started?" The inspector hesitated, perhaps unused to being greeted this way. "Water would be nice, thank you." Mark returned with a chilled bottle and handed it over. Then, without any sign of hurry, he gestured toward the path that led down to the lake. The wooden boards of the dock glowed faintly under the sunlight, their surfaces smooth from years of careful maintenance. The inspector began his work, pulling the measuring tape to check distances from the shoreline. He crouched to examine the support beams, occasionally scribbling on the clipboard. Mark stood a few steps away, his hands resting lightly on the railing. From where they were, the lake opened wide, its gentle waves lapping against the sides of the dock. A few gulls circled above, calling to one another. It was a calm scene, though Mark knew that on paper, this moment would be reduced to numbers and notes. As the inspector worked, Mark's gaze shifted toward the far end of the lake, where the water met a narrow inlet lined with tall reeds. That inlet, and the stream it fed into, was part of a larger water network under his direct management. The inspector likely didn't know it, but the lake they were standing over was classified as a privately managed waterway. Mark kept that thought to himself. There was no need to mention it yet. "How long has this dock been here?" the inspector asked without looking up. "Quite a while," Mark replied with an easy smile. "It's been maintained regularly. Every board, every bolt has been checked over the years." The inspector nodded, still focused on his work. He jotted down a final note, then folded the measuring tape. "All right, that should do it. I'll file my report with the board." "Appreciate you coming by," Mark said, "and thank you for your time." The man gave a small nod, returned to his car, and drove off, leaving only the faint hum of the engine fading into the distance. Mark remained by the dock for a few minutes longer, watching how the water moved around the posts. The afternoon sun shimmered off the ripples, each reflection shifting as if the lake itself were in quiet conversation. Back inside his study, Mark opened his notebook and wrote down the date and time of the inspection. He also noted the brief exchange they'd had and the measurements he'd seen the inspector take. It was a habit he'd learned long ago, always record details while they were fresh. He wasn't upset about the visit. In fact, he expected it. The association had its rules and inspections were part of how they enforced them. But this one carried a certain irony. From a legal standpoint, the inspector had been working in a jurisdiction that required his permission, a fact that would matter later if the conversation went further. For now, Mark decided not to make an issue of it. Patience had always been his way. He closed the notebook, slid it into the top drawer of his desk, and glanced out the window. The lake remained calm, its surface catching the golden light of late afternoon. Somewhere in the distance, a boat engine started, its sound soft and steady. Life went on as usual, at least for the moment. 2 days after the inspection, Mark sat at his desk with a blank sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery in front of him. The morning light filtered in through the tall window, casting a soft glow across the paper. He tapped his pen lightly, thinking through exactly what he wanted to say. He had no interest in sending a letter filled with sharp words or legal terms. That was not his way. Instead, he wanted something measured, polite, direct, and unmistakably clear. He began to write. In his careful, steady hand, "Dear Ms. Claremont, thank you for your attention to the matter of my dock. I appreciate the work the association does to maintain the shoreline and the shared spaces we all enjoy. I would like to confirm that the dock is fully compliant under county law and is maintained in accordance with long-standing permissions. As such, it will remain in place as it currently stands. I kindly request that any future inspections of my property be arranged through the proper channels before taking place. Thank you for your understanding. Sincerely, Mark Weston." When he finished, he read the letter twice to be certain it struck the right balance. It said everything necessary without straying into argument. He slid the paper into an envelope, sealed it, and addressed it neatly. On his way into town later that afternoon, he stopped by the community hall and left it with the receptionist, offering a friendly smile before continuing on with his errands. The next HOA meeting was still 2 weeks away, but Mark suspected the board would not wait that long to discuss the letter. He pictured the quiet conversations that might take place, the careful wording of replies, the flipping through of their own guidelines for confirmation. That evening, he took a slow walk down to the water's edge. The lake reflected the fading, light in shades of rose and gold. A gentle breeze stirred the reeds near the shore. As he stood there, he thought about the layers of process that might now be unfolding, and how, quietly, he could begin a process of his own. The following morning, Mark placed a call to the County Water Management Department. He spoke with a long-time contact, a man named Lewis, who had been in his position for over 20 years. "Lewis, it's Mark Weston," he began. "I'd like to request a review of several shoreline structures around Lakeshore Heights. Specifically, the community marina and any shared-use docks the association maintains." Lewis asked a few clarifying questions, then confirmed the request would be placed on the department's upcoming site review schedule. "Shouldn't be a problem," he said. "We'll take a look and see what's in order." Mark thanked him, knowing the review would reveal what he already understood, that some of the HOA's own structures extended into waterways under his management, and that their permits might not be entirely up to date. Back in his study, he pulled his notebook closer and wrote down the date of his conversation with Lewis, along with a brief summary. His notes were never elaborate, but they were precise. Over time, they formed a quiet but complete record of events. In the days that followed, Mark went about his routine as usual. He tended his garden, repaired a loose board on the porch steps, and spent a few afternoons fishing from the far end of the dock. He greeted neighbors warmly when they passed, and accepted their small bits of conversation about the weather, the lake, and upcoming gatherings. No one could tell that a quiet current was building beneath the surface of these calm days, but Mark could feel it. The process had begun, and it was moving forward at its own steady pace, one that, like the lake itself, he understood completely. The review took place on a bright mid-morning, the kind where the sky seemed too clear to suggest anything serious was about to happen. A county workboat arrived first, its small outboard engine leaving a gentle wake as it glided toward the Lakeshore Heights Marina. Two officials stepped out, both wearing light blue polo shirts with the County Water Management logo stitched over the pocket. From a distance, Mark watched from his dock, coffee in hand. He didn't need to be at the marina to know how this would go, but he was curious to see the pace of events. The officials were met by Dana Claremont and two other HOA board members. Their polite handshakes and friendly expressions carried the careful tone of people confident they could handle the matter. Dana gestured toward the main dock, leading the officials across its planks. The county staff began their inspection the way professionals always did, by measuring distances, checking for posted permits, and reviewing the alignment of structures against property lines. It was all routine, at least for the first few minutes. Then Mark noticed a subtle shift in body language. One official crouched near the edge of the dock, pointing to the waterline markers fixed to the pilings. The other consulted a clipboard, flipping through sheets of paper before looking back at the first. Dana leaned forward slightly, trying to follow the conversation. From where he stood, Mark couldn't hear their words, but he didn't need to. He recognized the moment when someone realized they were standing on a structure that extended into a jurisdiction they hadn't accounted for. After several more minutes of quiet discussion, the officials asked to see documentation for the marina's permits. Dana produced a folder from a satchel, handing it over with a confident smile. That smile faded slowly as the officials compared the documents to their own records. One of the officials straightened and spoke in a calm, professional tone, his gestures indicating the far edge of the dock. Dana's head turned to follow his hand. Mark could almost imagine the explanation, that the marina's outer section extended into waters classified as privately managed, and that the permits for its continued use would need updating through the proper channels. The group moved toward the smaller fishing platform nearby, repeating the process. Each measurement, each check against county maps, likely confirmed the same thing. By the time they finished, Dana's posture had shifted from confident to thoughtful. The entire visit took less than an hour. The officials shook hands again, though this time the gestures carried a more formal weight. They stepped back onto their boat, started the engine, and eased away from the marina, heading toward their next site. Dana and the other board members remained by the shoreline for a few moments, speaking in low voices. Eventually, they gathered their things and walked back toward the community hall. That afternoon, as the sunlight began to fade, Mark received a short email from the HOA's secretary. It read, "Dear Mr. Weston, the board would like to arrange a time to discuss your dock and related matters concerning shoreline management. Please let us know when you might be available for a meeting. Thank you." Lakeshore Heights Homemark read the message twice. The wording was careful, without any mention of the county review, but the timing made the connection clear. He set the email aside for the moment and returned to the porch, watching as the lake settled into its evening calm. A single canoe glided past, the paddler's movements slow and unhurried. The discovery at the marina had shifted the current of the conversation. What had started as a request for him to remove his dock had opened a much larger topic, one that now included the association's own place on these waters. Mark knew the next meeting would not be like the last. This time, the board would arrive with questions and he would decide exactly how much of the story to tell. The meeting was arranged for a Thursday evening at the community hall. The air outside was still warm from the late summer sun, and the scent of freshly cut grass lingered along the sidewalk leading to the entrance. Mark arrived a few minutes early, carrying a slim leather folder under his arm. Inside, the hall was quieter than usual. Only Dana and two other board members were seated at the long table. They greeted him with polite nods, and Dana gestured toward a chair directly across from her. "Thank you for coming, Mark," she began, her tone measured but warmer than at the last meeting. "We thought it would be helpful to speak directly about the dock matter and a few related concerns." Mark sat, resting the folder on the table without opening it. "Of course," he said. "I'm always glad to have a conversation." Dana folded her hands, glancing briefly at the others before continuing. "As you may know, the county recently reviewed some of our shoreline structures. They found that a portion of our marina and fishing platform extends into waters that, according to their records, are under your management." Mark nodded once, not interrupting. "This was unexpected," Dana went on. "We've always operated under the assumption that our permits covered the entire span. It appears that may not be the case." One of the board members leaned forward. "We're not here to dispute the findings," he said quickly. "We're here because we'd like to find a way forward that works for everyone." Mark allowed a moment of silence before speaking. "I appreciate that. My family has been responsible for maintaining and managing these waters for many years. That includes ensuring structures like docks and marinas are safe, well-kept, and compliant with the proper permits. I have no objection to the HOA's facilities, but they do need to meet those standards, just as you've asked my dock to meet yours." Dana's expression softened slightly. "That's fair," she said. "Would you be willing to help us bring our permits into alignment? The last thing we want is to have restrictions placed on our residents' use of the marina." "That can be done," Mark replied. "I'll assist with the paperwork and guide the process. In return, I'd ask that my dock be left as it is, with no further requests for modification unless there's a safety concern." The board members exchanged brief glances, then nodded. "That's reasonable," Dana said. "We can agree to that." Mark reached for his folder and opened it, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "I've drafted a simple agreement, stating that both parties will maintain their structures in compliance with the relevant authorities and that communication will remain open should any issues arise. If you're comfortable with it, we can sign it tonight." The document was short, less than a page, but its language was clear. It acknowledged the HOA's facilities, his dock, and the shared commitment to keeping the shoreline well managed. Dana read it carefully, then handed it to the other two board members. After a few quiet minutes, she picked up a pen and signed. Passing it around for the others to do the same, Mark added his own signature last. "I think this will work well for everyone," he said. There was a quiet sense of relief in the room. The conversation shifted briefly to upcoming community events and general maintenance schedules. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere was far more cordial than it had been in weeks. Outside, the evening sky had turned to a soft blend of lavender and gold. Mark walked back toward his home, the agreement tucked safely in his folder. He knew this resolution wasn't just about keeping his dock. It was about setting a tone, one where cooperation and respect guided decisions, and where the water, in all its calm persistence, remained the silent thread that tied the community together. The days following the agreement moved at the lake's natural pace, slow, steady, and without hurry. The tension that had once drifted through conversations at the shoreline seemed to dissolve, replaced by the easy rhythm of neighbors greeting one another and boats coming and going from the docks. Mark noticed the difference almost immediately. No more quiet glances in his direction when he walked past the community hall. No more folded papers left in his mailbox. Instead, he received a few friendly waves from board members he hadn't spoken with much before. Dana herself stopped by one morning during her walk to offer a brief update on the permit process for the marina. "It's going smoothly," she said, the edge of formality gone from her voice. "The county expects to have everything finalized in a few weeks. Thank you for helping us with it." Mark gave a small nod. "I'm glad it's working out." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it carried an ease that hadn't been there at the start of all this. In the quiet of his own property, Mark went about his routines as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. Early mornings still found him on the porch with his coffee, watching the first light stretch across the water. The dock stood, as it always had, its weathered boards warmed by the sun, the gentle creak of its timbers, a familiar sound in the stillness. One afternoon, while sanding a small section of railing, he paused to watch two teenagers paddling a bright red kayak past the far end of the dock. They waved as they went by, and he returned the gesture with a quiet smile. In the distance, the HOA marina was busy with families preparing to fish or head out for an evening ride. The water carried the sound of their laughter in soft echoes. It struck him, not for the first time, how the lake itself seemed to hold these moments together. The rules, the agreements, the signed papers, all necessary, yes. But they were only tools for maintaining what already existed naturally when people treated the water and each other with care. Mark understood that his role as a steward of these waterways was not about asserting control. It was about balance. The agreement with the HOA was a reflection of that, a quiet understanding that, while written on paper, truly lived in how both sides now approached each other. In the evenings, he sometimes walked the length of his dock, just as the sun dipped low, turning the sky to a deep amber. From there, he could see nearly every bend and curve of the lake. He knew where the inlets hid, where the current shifted, and where the water deepened unexpectedly. These details had been part of his life for as long as he could remember, passed down through stories and responsibilities from the generations before him. One night, as the last traces of daylight faded, Mark stood at the very end of the dock, hands in his pockets, and listened to the gentle lap of water against the pilings. The agreement with the HOA was done, the permits were in progress, and the air was free of tension. The lake, in its quiet way, had returned to harmony. He didn't need recognition for it, nor did he expect anyone to speak about it openly. The knowledge of how it had unfolded, from a letter in his mailbox to the shared commitment that now stood, was enough. When he finally turned to walk back toward the house, the lights from a boat crossing the far side of the lake flickered. In the dark, every vessel out there, every ripple of water beneath it, was part of the system he quietly managed. And he knew, as he always had, that true stewardship was less about what others saw, and more about what you made sure remained unseen, yet steady, for years to come.